Hello everyone, this is Tim Cummins from IECCM. Delighted to welcome you to today's Selectica webinar, where we are working together on the subject of better contract governance through workflow. And we have three presenters, I think, during the course of today, and they are well, I'll tell you who they are in just a moment. We're going to do quick presenter introductions. We're then going to have a section that looks a little bit at workflow challenges. Selectica are going to then give a perspective on those workflow challenges, and we're going to conclude with a case study, a great example of where tackling workflow can bring tremendous business benefit. And as far as the participants are concerned, as you can see, you have various controls that you can use, but we'll move on from there into our presenters. Well, I'm Tim Cummins, and CEO of IECCM, and joined today by Bill DiMartino, who is, as you can see, Vice President of Solution Strategy at Selectica, and by Eric Gonzalez, who's Solutions Engineer with Selectica. And Bill is going to take our second section, and Eric, I think, is going to be introducing the case study. So, Bill, Eric, welcome.
Thanks, Tim.
Okay, so let's get moving then with the first section, where I'm going to continue speaking, because I'm just going to talk a bit about the workflow challenges. And this comes from the backdrop of the IECCM membership. Many of you, of course, on the program today are probably very familiar with who we are, but some of you maybe not. So just as a quick introduction, IECCM is a non-profit association, in fact the only association globally focused on contract and commercial management. And we have members who represent somewhere over 13,000 different organizations around the world. We have measurable member groups in about 160 different countries, very much cross-industry, and equally a divide of people representing the buy side of contracting and others representing the sell side of contracting. So we see workflow and all of its implications from both the buy side and the sell side for the business. So first of all, let's just have a look at why it is that workflow so much matters. And as you can see popping up on our screen here, we have 10 pitfalls, 10 things that are weaknesses in many contract management systems and processes. And these come from IECCM research, which was looking at and identifying the potential return on investment that organizations can achieve through having more integrated approaches to their contracting management and policy and practice. It is in many organizations today still a relatively disaggregated activity. It's often not really thought of as a life cycle. There are distinct process elements around the bidding or the contract drafting and preparation, and the negotiation, and then the transition into a post-award environment, and then the post-award management and closeout itself. And these are often performed, of course, by very different groups within the business, and sadly very often it is just not simply handled as the coordinated workflow. And that brings and certainly contributes to many of the sorts of weaknesses that we're highlighting here, because perhaps different groups involved in that workflow don't necessarily have an appreciation of the impact that they're having on other components of the process. So as we look at this particular set of pitfalls, I think you can see that they are illustrative very much of that workflow, starting off really with the initiation of requirement analysis or capability analysis, depending on whether you're buying or you're selling, right the way through to that post-award contract management and eventual closeout. And of course, we only really get insight into many of these problems if there's thorough data capture and analysis. And very often, again, the disaggregation of this particular activity means that there isn't any coordinated insight into what is it that most frequently goes wrong? How can we in fact improve? Which means that many contracts groups and legal groups and procurement groups struggle to really demonstrate their value to the business. Whereas in fact, if we looked at more of an integrated workflow and were monitoring performance through it, the scale of the value that good contracting actually brings to the business becomes very evident and extremely compelling. So if for no other reason than your own self-preservation and value contribution to the business, what we're talking about today is really important. Now, one of the things that flows from all of that is the need for any good contracts organization and process to have a thorough understanding of the stakeholders. Now, the stakeholders vary. It isn't a rigid set of people who are involved in every transaction or deal. Indeed, as you look at levels of complexity, for example, a purchase order is going to have a very different set of stakeholders who need to be involved from the situation where you're dealing with perhaps a major teaming agreement or a large outsourcing arrangement. But thinking through the portfolio of stakeholders that need to be involved is something that's often a weakness in organizations and again impacts, of course, the quality of workflow management. One of the critical points to remember with stakeholders and their engagement and management is that it varies very much depending upon the levels of complexity and the levels of specialism. And one of the things we've seen over recent years is the growth of more and more in-depth specialism. A legal department is a great example where you'll have experts within that department on things like cybersecurity or data protection, others on intellectual property. And so very often we're not going to just a function as part of our workflow, we're going to potentially many specialists within a function. What we need to do, and what this chart is depicting, is we need to not only think about who are the stakeholders internal to our business, perhaps in our partner's business, but also external to the business. They can be shareholders, it may be a project that affects the general public, or which hits into the regulators. So we have a wide variety of stakeholders, and we need to categorize those as we plan our workflow so that we actually think about their relevant influence, both in terms of making this particular transaction or opportunity succeed, but also the people who could potentially derail it. And as you can see, this is an example of the way that you might want to segment those stakeholders in determining how you handle them within the overall workflow process. Stakeholder management is something that's being recognized extensively as one of the most critical areas of added value and, of course, one of the most critical areas that will keep a project on track and lead to a successful delivery. So what are some of the measures that people are undertaking to tackle that complexity of workflow? Well, here are a few examples that we're seeing from our members currently. We're seeing a number of them moving more towards principles-based negotiation. Now, what that means is they're trying to provide greater empowerment out into the business. They're using technology, they're using apps, they're using training programs, they're using playbooks and guidance to try to move away from rigid templates which actually stifle creativity and undermine value, and are moving instead to much more in the way of guidance with term optioneering or variability that people can draw from, and of course with support centers for those situations where they really do need expert guidance from the lawyers or the contracts professionals. We're also seeing a real growth of interest in industry standard agreements, a recognition that actually the company-by-company standards that we have today are a source of significant inefficiency and risk, and they're frequently unnecessary. They are theoretically dealing with risk, but in practice creating it. So there's more and more interest in how we could move towards industry standards, particularly perhaps linking that to some of the principles-based negotiation, so that you call in different standard terms depending upon the nature of the scenario you're dealing with. This is also leading to much better or much greater thinking about the true risks of many deals. What we've seen is historically, I think, far too much focus on risk consequence being tackled through the contracting process without enough thought about risk likelihood. And a number of organizations, again, are undertaking far more sophisticated analysis of risk probabilities, because in fact many times the probable risks are not well tackled at all. They are simply protected against by terms and conditions that try and limit responsibility and liability, rather than actually understanding what the probable risks are and mitigating them and using that as a source of competitive advantage. We're also seeing many organizations becoming far more sophisticated in what they term obligation management, which is, of course, the extraction of data from contracts, and by the way, they're also looking hard now at contract design to make that obligation extraction far easier, and then the flow through, the dissemination of those obligations out into the business so that the users of the contract actually understand what it is that they're responsible for doing, and that there can be accurate centralized tracking of whether or not obligations are being performed. And those trackings may actually be within shared systems or shared tools for both the buyer and the seller. And finally, I think another very interesting area is far more thought now being given to contract owners and their responsibilities. In many businesses, the groups that actually prepared the contract, drafted the contract, signed the contract, and may even have overseen its transition are not the people who are responsible for its actual performance and oversight. That's often somebody out in the business. It could be somebody in sales, it could be a project manager, it could be an operations person, an engineer, highly variable as to where contract ownership sits. And in many organizations, contract owners have never been equipped with the tool set to support them in their workflow responsibility. They're very often not educated, trained, given guidance or meaningful support. And of course that contributes dramatically to the underperformance of many contracts. And that, as I said, is a significant focus area for many organizations. Now within all of this, as the simple little graphic at the bottom illustrates, organizations do need to think carefully about how they segment the nature of their contracts. The workflow complexity will vary very substantially depending on whether it's an easy or simple standard agreement through medium or higher levels of complexity. And organizations need to define what for them represents issues of complexity. I thought it would be interesting just to show how all of this thinking about workflow is affecting the approach to contracting. And here is a particularly interesting example which is actually taken from the UK government. They have been doing a tremendous amount of work looking at how they can drive greater success from contracts and how they avoid the costly and highly publicized failures that all too often affect public sector contracting. Our argument would be that actually it isn't unique in any way to public sector that these contracts go wrong. It's simply that because of public audit, they become visible. But UK government has concluded that not only is it not prepared any longer to be wasting so much public money on failed contracts, but more than that, they've recognized that they really need to improve competence in this area because more and more of their activities are being outsourced. More and more services depend upon private sector contracts. So they've really been focusing on the question of how do we improve workflow, how do we make it more integrated, but also how do we build the underlying organizational skills and competencies to do this better. And as you can see, what they recognized, and this is actually true with the US government, the Australian government, and quite a few others at the moment, they've recognized that they've invested very heavily in this central piece, the procurement process. But very often, to put it simply, they finish up with the wrong supplier because they don't really go to market in the right way. They define or underdefine the requirements, and so they finish up with the wrong solutions, and then they throw it over a wall and nobody really manages that supplier or that contract. So they either contract for the wrong thing with the wrong person, or they fail to oversee the right delivery structures. The UK government, therefore, as you can see, this has now become a highly integrated process with actually a fundamental redefinition of where time is spent. And they have now appointed a whole series of commercial managers to manage the front end of this through to contract signature, and contract managers to manage through the back end of it. I think it's a very exciting proposition, and it's more and more symbolic, I think, of the way that many organizations are beginning to understand that contracting and contract competence is actually a critical capability for their business and a tremendous source today of value loss, and tomorrow of potential value gain and competitive difference. So where exactly are we today? I thought we would just finish off with a quick view of a few of the charts out of IACCM's recent benchmarking study. Some of you may have participated. We've had about 700 participants in a very comprehensive benchmarking study, and I'm just going to show you a few selected charts out of dozens that we have reflecting current performance in many ways. Now, one example of this, particularly interesting, I think, is the efficiency with which workflow is managed has a direct impact on the full-time equivalent headcount that's needed in the world of contracting. So in organizations where there is no dedicated contract commercial staff overseeing contract workflow, on average, they utilize 118 heads sitting out somewhere in the business, in project management, in legal perhaps, who are doing contracts work that is not being done centrally. On the other hand, where there is a dedicated contract and commercial staff, that number drops to 32. Now, of course, we have to add to that the dedicated contract commercial staff, which on average is about 40 heads. So what we've discovered there is that having a dedicated contracts commercial staff typically reduces headcount needs to support contracting by about 35 to 40%. Quite an impressive reduction and cost saving and good rationale to build a professional organization to oversee this workflow. What else as examples? Well, the other thing that we can point out, or another example we can point at, is the impact that good workflow management has on things like cycle times. Now, everybody understands that cycle times are important. Cycle times from bid to contract signature, the number of weeks we take, is very significant in terms of, again, competitive advantage, time to cash, time to new product development. A whole series of positives come, of course, from reduced cycle times. As you can see, the variations are very significant. The top quartile companies, for example, are in the 0 to 25, and the bottom quartile companies in that 75 to 100%. Where are you? It's probably a pretty interesting question. And although, well, the variations, as you can see, even on very low complexity contracts, are really quite significant. As you get down to that bottom quartile, they're taking 3 times as long as many of their higher performing counterparts or competitors. In the medium complexity, again, it's roughly a multiplier of 4 times. And in the high complexity, once again, we're often looking at something like 4 times variation, and we're looking at a differential there between, say, 2 months and something like 7 or 8 months. So these are really significant time periods which illustrate real importance of driving that workflow improvement. And where is it that people are spending their time? Again, this is a workflow view that shows us roughly where the average contracts organization is spending most of its time, and you can see that post-award contract management is today by far the most significant area. Negotiation is in second place, and drafting and development activity in third. All of those have opportunities, or certainly the negotiation and contract drafting and development are things that can be dramatically improved on if we have proactive workflow management. So I hope these are some useful illustrations that lead us through now to Bill. I'm going to pass the baton to you, Bill, at least I hope I am, and we're going to give you control of these charts, I think. I'm sorry, that's the one, I think. If we make you the presenter, Bill, I think you should now have the opportunity to take control.
Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you, Tim. I do have it. A little bit of a mute problem there. Before I get started, I wanted to quickly note that I am standing in for Constantine. So for those of you who are expecting to hear his voice, I apologize. He had unforeseen circumstances that were preventing him from joining us today, and I will do my best stand-in for my colleague. So a quick word on Selectica. We're very excited about the progress that the organization has been making over the last year. The integration of Selectica and IASTA is going to plan with great market reception and really allowing us to move towards achieving the vision that we have for our solutions and to deliver value to our customers. And as we continue on our journey as a company to expand our capabilities to serve our customers, we recently announced the acquisition of Deepak, who is a Magic Quadrant visionary in the P2P area. And so that's something that, related to our discussion today, is really going to allow us to deliver on the promise of contract compliance. So really the full life cycle will be handled of the contract, from the negotiation process all the way through to the buying and the paying process, and ensuring that what we're contracting is actually being delivered and being measured. So let's talk more specifically about the topic at hand today. So the challenges that are bringing all of us together today, you're all very familiar with them, and these challenges are topics that I know that Tim has talked a lot about in the past, and we could summarize them differently, but I think in the end we're seeing a real resurgence or a renaissance in the need for contract management driven by the market today. And with that resurgence, the need for workflow is ever more present. It's really difficult to achieve the mandates of these pressures if you're not instituting a workflow across the organization. These aren't challenges that can be met with the implementation of a repository. So as we think about that, and we think about the resurgence of contract management driven by these market forces, this is one view of a journey that an enterprise could go on to really further the impact of the contract management processes. And this, of course, is one view and one sample journey, and perhaps not the one that you're currently going on. But clearly, we've seen historically that a lot of folks have started with the repositories as the how do I dip my toes in the water and start moving. And this is both on the buy side and on the sell side. And the common next step, and really the thing that initiates the maturity cycle, is to institute workflow. Once that process is started, we then see a tremendous amount of momentum building within the organization to continue to go up the maturity curve, to offer additional capabilities and bring additional value to the organization. So really, we see the institution or the implementation of workflow as the linchpin to an organization's maturity in CLM. Now, in Tim's presentation, he talked about stakeholders, and this is a little bit of a different view of stakeholders. We see this view based upon who we're talking to and who's buying our solutions and who's actually going to be using, consuming our solutions. But the other way to think about this view is each one of these stakeholders today, they need to collaborate with each other more and more. And they need to collaborate so that we can ensure that we have buy-in from the appropriate resources, so that people know when the transitions are happening. And ultimately, by having this unified workflow mechanism, we're giving visibility to the entire process to all the relevant parties. And hopefully, when that contract is signed and it's put into execution, it's not a surprise to anyone in the organization. So we feel, from our experiences with the customer base, both on the buy side and the sell side, the value that they're deriving from workflow is, as Tim talked about, there's really no questioning what this is going to do in terms of value. If you think about it from the buy side, the areas of savings, the areas of compliance, the idea of alignment between supply chain and procurement is something that are top of mind, something that we're able to achieve with this solution. Also, if you think about the sell side, the key driving factor oftentimes is how can I reduce my cycles so that I'm able to achieve the savings targets and the selling quotas that I have within the framework of the resources that are available to me. And these case studies really illustrate the effectiveness to both sides of the organization. All right, so let's get into some of the nuts and bolts of workflow. So what we're depicting here is different levels of sophistication or complexity of workflow. And we want to make sure that the solutions and the processes that are implemented around the workflow are able to align with the specifics of any organization. So clearly there's going to be simple scenarios, and there's going to be dynamic, or what we often think of as intelligent scenarios. So how can my workflow adapt to the business scenario of this particular negotiation? Being able to adapt the scenario in real time is something that is critical to drive effectiveness. And the other part of being dynamic is really being able to change the actual workflows themselves. So I want to have a series of workflows that are specific to each of my contract types. So my NDA workflow is going to be different from my HR workflow, which is going to be different from my sell-side contract workflow. But I also want to be able to allow my power users to go in periodically and perhaps enhance or change and alter those workflows. So putting that power in the hands of the users is going to be critical as you move forward. Okay. Now, one of the areas that Selectica really focuses on is how can I take this contracting process and really make it as effective as possible. And what I mean by that is if I look at the contract as one single document, I'm going to limit the visibility to the inners of the contract. So if you take that contract and you separate into three components, into the fields that I'm collecting, into the language or the clauses that are coming out of my library, and into a template, which really is how I'm going to collect and order these topics, I then have the ability to see within the contract and have a workflow that's specific to each one of the clauses. So this gives you really a very precise tool to target the issue, the negotiation, to the clause, to the right person at the right time. And with that ability really opens up a new world of opportunity in terms of efficiency. So if I'm able to track and monitor the negotiation process at the clause level, if I'm able to identify who is actually the bottleneck or who is making this process go faster, I'm then able to modify both my processes and potentially even my clauses, either for a single negotiation process or overall generically, so that I can achieve better outcomes in a more efficient manner when needed. So as an example, it's the end of the quarter. you have an important negotiation coming up with a customer, your standard indemnification clause typically causes you to have an extended negotiation process. You want to avoid that. You're then able to perhaps choose one of your alternate clauses prior to the start of negotiation so that you can cut down the overall cycle time. Tremendous benefit and value to the business, and I'm sure the sales organizations will be very happy to have that in their hands. All right, and my last parting topic here is just a glimpse into what else we could do with workflow. So primarily, we think about the negotiation process as where workflow comes into being, and there's no doubt that is the fundamental use of it. But we're also seeing adoption from our customers in some other areas. So for instance, I've got a large organization, many different people are participating in the creation and management of my standard language. We can utilize workflow to actually track the approval process of the new language, the changes of the language, and that really, again, brings us to a higher level of visibility and control. So with that, I'm going to stop and hand it over to Eric.
Thanks, Bill.
Eric, it should be yours now.
Just a moment. All right, thank you. All right. Terrific. Well, thank you, Bill. Appreciate that. So what we wanted to do was share a case study with you. Now, we've spoken previously about compliance in the context of responding to market forces, and we wanted to provide a case study that speaks specifically to that. We're talking just not only about internal controls and compliance at the beginning of the contracting cycle and throughout the contracting cycle, but also in response to PR crises. Here's one example. First of all, you'll notice that this is a screen grab right from Amazon.com for a product that is produced by PepsiCo. And you'll notice something that's a little odd about this, right? So if you look kind of towards the middle, you can kind of see it. Oh yeah, there it is. You'll notice that there's a 1-star rating on this Amazon product. And you know, you kind of left scratching your head when you look at this. If you've ever tried it, it's a pretty good product, but there are over 4,000 customer reviews which you know, culminate in that 1-star rating. You kind of start wondering, well, what's going on here? Why is the brand being tarnished by some of these consumer reviews? Is it a terrible product? Does it need to be pulled? Well, actually, when you drill down into the customer reviews, you start coming up with a very different story. Here are some of the comments. For example, what this particular consumer titled the review, "Pepsi needs to commit to stop rainforest destruction." Well, oh my, okay, so look at another one. 1 star for the corporation that only cares about profits. People can make a difference. So what's going on here is, if you look at this one example, what you have here is not so much a review of a product in an open public forum, but what you have in effect is a potential movement that potentially damages the brand, right? And so the key here is, the key question to ask is, how can we support PR crisis response and turn this around using contract lifecycle based workflow? And there are some very real, there's some very powerful processes and workflows here and internal controls that we can put in place to help support this PR crisis response. One thing that is kind of fun to watch, but really doesn't help, is that some consumers actually are very supportive of the brand. And so a little humor there that we found in the Amazon comments. But while that comment won't help, what will help is strong commitments backed by workflow-based enforcement and also complete transparency. Okay? So basically, workflows can help us provide transparent enforcement, and here's how. First, keep in mind that this isn't an isolated case. Brands avoiding bad PR or proactively responding to PR crises like this is common. For example, if you pop open Google, you'll find that McDonald's recently committed to antibiotic-free chicken, for example, by 2017. So this is a fairly common scenario, and companies are increasingly looking to workflow-based internal controls to provide support for some of their public-facing commitments. First, let's come back to PepsiCo and understand what the issue is. Basically, the concern here amongst a number of consumers is around deforestation. That is, there's a practice of clearing natural forests for the purpose of agriculture and logging and those sorts of things. And one of the key things that a number of activists have kind of jumped on is the concern around palm oil specifically. There are something like 50,000 square miles of forest lost every year. A lot of that, but almost a majority of that, to palm oil plantations. And if you're wondering, I mean, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around that number. That's equivalent to about 36 football fields every minute, and that's a statistic right from the WWF. So, what can PepsiCo do? Well, first of all, the approach here is to commit to transparency and some strong internal controls supporting sustainable palm oil, and doing so right in lockstep with a number of NGOs like the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil. So what Pepsi did in response to this crisis is up the ante or reconfirm that in 2010 PepsiCo submitted through the RSPO, that Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, an NGO, to source 100% sustainable palm oil by 2015. That is, by the end of this year, they have made the commitment to be 100% sustainable on their sourcing of palm oil. Okay, so what does that mean really? What does PepsiCo mean when it makes that commitment? Well, basically, if you take the public-facing commitment or the response that PepsiCo has issued on its website, which, by the way, you can download via that link, you'll basically notice it comes down to three things. The first is sourcing products through RSPO member suppliers that have been fully vetted by this NGO, ensuring via internal controls and with full transparency that resources were sourced from sustainable and responsible sources. And then the third piece of it is that all contracting activity needs to be in compliance with forestry stewardship policies. And there is no further development to grow plantations on the back of high carbon stock forests, what they call high conservation value forests as well. So how do we use workflow to back up these commitments? How do we basically put teeth on this? Well, here's one framework. One of the things that we can do here is we can adopt a matrix-like structure where each group, each business unit has a responsibility and visibility into each step of the contracting process. And if you look at this model, it's a fairly simple model. Over at the top, the little arrow at the top, you'll see request, collaborate, negotiate, and execute. So fairly standard contract lifecycle model here. And in this model, you have basically three groups that are involved. This is a bit of a simplification. Sometimes there are quite a bit more groups, but generally speaking, all of the groups that are involved in adopting a contract generally fall into one of three responsibility centers: sourcing and sourcing supplier information management, risk management, and legal. And so I won't read the whole sort of slide. If you'd like, you can make this slide available as well. But obviously, this is a little bit more of a matrix structure. So many CLM systems will have a little bit of trouble adopting this sort of visibility and this sort of control structure, where each individual group, sourcing, risk, and legal, have a stake in each one of these steps in the contracting process. And the reason is because many of them actually adopt sort of linear processes. So one thing to keep in the back of your mind is, can we adopt sort of smart workflows and parallel workflows? So something to keep in mind as you are looking to adopt a new contract lifecycle management system. And one thing that's fairly obvious is, of course, to keep in mind is how you use the technology to support some of these initiatives is just as important as what you deploy. right? So that's pretty obvious. What isn't so obvious is how to implement that. So using this framework here, where we have each individual group have a stake in each one of the sections, let me just highlight two individual areas. Of course, you probably don't need me to read the slide to you, but let me just highlight two areas. The first is you'll see at the intersection of risk management in the collaborate stage, you'll see a box there that says auditable change management. Well, what does that mean? That means transparency, basically allowing third parties to audit contractual compliance. From a technology standpoint, it's as simple as providing the RSPO and other NGOs visibility into that contracting process. Maybe they can go ahead and log in as a view-only user and report on some of the activities to, as an independent third party, confirm that commitments are being upheld, right? So that's just part of the workflow, right? Many of these NGOs, when they audit sustainability initiatives, what they'll look for is the ability to, let's say, shift to alternate vendors if an existing vendor cannot make the appropriate level commitments, right? So that's part of that as well, basically being able to audit that and report on those changes. Tim, earlier in the presentation, mentioned a principles-based negotiation. Well, that's part of this as well. Rather than tying down groups to specific clauses and specific contracts, basically a lot of organizations are now moving towards this principles-based negotiation. And as you'll see here, sort of the second thing as we shift over to the other thing I wanted to talk about is the ability to maybe deny clause changes that a supplier would like to introduce during contract negotiation, right? So if you look at the negotiate phase in the process and where legal comes in, that box down there at the intersection between legal and the negotiate phase in the process is alternate clause enforcement down at the bottom. Basically, that allows legal to specify what changes can be made to a contract and what clauses are simply not up for negotiation at all, right? So being able to take not just a document and sort of look at that document as a whole, but look at that document as a collection of clauses, each of those clauses having specific workflow implications. That's really powerful stuff. And that's the kind of internal control environment that really provides value to management and really supports a response to a PR crisis like the one that Pepsi has had. So, in summary, what has PepsiCo done? What could they do, right? Well, there's a couple of very simple steps that they can do, that they can take, excuse me, adopting that sort of matrix-like framework that we just looked at. Specifically around sourcing through RSPO member suppliers and making sure that they are originating source materials from responsible and sustainable sources. The first, obviously, is make sure that the member suppliers are centrally maintained in an authorized supplier directory. If a supplier is not in that directory, they're simply eliminated from the bidding process. It's that simple. The stakes here are too high, and so we don't necessarily want to allow sourcing people to sort of get off the reservation, so to speak, right? So I think in compliance with some of these internal control policies, requesters are not authorized to add suppliers unless they've gone through a strenuous audit process. And as far as originating from responsible, sustainable sources and, of course, transparently auditing that to ensure compliance, sustainability certification and third-party contract documentation is, of course, required prior to tendering an offer to PepsiCo. Yearly contract renewal tracking for audit engagements, right? So what we're looking at there is every year when a sourcing agreement gets renewed, part of that process is to introduce a workflow that kicks off 90 days prior to that contract renewal, in this case, that will launch the company into a recertification of that supplier. So in full transparency and in full concert with some of these NGOs, providing some of that visibility via field audits and ensuring that providers of materials are in full compliance with Pepsi's policies. And of course, transparently tracing source palm oil right to the plantation level. An appropriately implemented workflow system can actually capture all that information and trace it all the way back to specific to the specific plantation for some of these source materials. And of course, all of these benefits are just incredibly powerful in supporting the response to some of these market demands. But what's icing on the cake, I would say, is that in implementing some of this workflow, not only are we responding to market forces, but we are also cutting off millions of dollars in compliance costs by centralizing all of these processes in a contract lifecycle management system that adopts the kinds of workflows that model how we really work, frankly, as opposed to some basic linear stuff, which every system can do. But it's important to implement the right processes and the right technologies. And the benefits, of course, are manifold, both in the market, both in the market as well as internal, as far as cost reduction is concerned. So that's it for our case study. I'm going to turn this right back over to Tim for additional questions.
Well, actually, you can probably keep it there because I don't think we've got any extra charts, so we really do just come to that question now. Perfect. I think, don't we? And we do have a good number of questions here, actually. So let's kick into those straight away. One which we can probably all give an opinion on. Would be interesting to see whether we've got the same opinions. What one thing can we do right away to improve our contract governance? Asks Felix. So who's going to be the lucky starter with that one? Well, I've had a moment to think about it because I've had the advantage of seeing the question. So while perhaps Bill and Eric give it some thought, I'll say, I think for me, Felix, it would actually be building or investing in a searchable contracts repository, because I think if you can't find your contracts and if you can't do any analysis on them, that is a pretty fundamental failing to governance. It really does illustrate the business's failure to understand the critical importance of contracts as one of their core economic assets. If you just lose them and don't really care, it means that you don't really have any understanding of what contracts are about. So that's the one I'd begin with.
Yes, Tim, this is Bill, and I would just extend what you're saying, because I was thinking the exact same thing. Is in addition to finding the documents themselves, the logical next first step is to understand the first level of quote-unquote metadata within those contracts. So who's the supplier, when do they start and become effective, and when do they go out of effect, and when are they coming up for renewal? If you have that base information, at least you can begin to gain control of upcoming processes.
Yeah, and to add to that, Felix, and thank you for the question, basically just to support what Bill said, what he's talking about here is identifying priorities as well. If you think about it, it's part and parcel to what he's talking about. In the case of PepsiCo, they identified their priority. Their priority was to quickly respond to this crisis and implement an enforcement policy that has some teeth to it. It isn't just talk. And they've done a fantastic job. But it all starts with identifying that metadata and what the priority is, and making sure that you are tracking the right metadata in this contract in a enterprise-wide contract lifecycle management system.
Slightly technical question in a way, but probably important. Somebody, maybe there are others who weren't clear what this is about. We've mentioned several times through the program the word segmentation, and somebody's asked, what is segmentation? So very simply, segmentation is where you divide things into comparable groups. So, for example, if you were looking at a whole series of contracts, you might have a load of them that are purchase orders, you might have others that are master services agreements, and you might have a third group which are highly customized outsourcing agreements, for instance. So those would be quite distinct groups. If you tried to deal with all of them in exactly the same way, you wouldn't deal with any of them very well. So that would be an example where you do segmentation. Similarly, you might look at 50 contracts and you might say, well, actually 10 of them have got 30-day payment terms, 24 have got 60-day payment terms, etc. That would be another way of segmenting, in the sense that you need to handle them differently. So it's building categories or groups of things that have similar features and characteristics so that you can handle them more efficiently and more effectively. So we then have a question actually about contract ownership. Contract owners not equipped or knowledgeable of the terms of the contract. What's the best way to hand the implementation and management of the terms? How can the information flow full circle and be documented if only certain modules were implemented, et cetera, et cetera? I think, so, I mean, in general, we obviously see obligation management and the flow through to contract owners of their understanding of what needs to be done and then their monitoring of whether it's done being very dependent upon the technologies that are actually driving much of the complexity that contract owners are having to handle. So I suppose my simple answer to that one would be it is being done generally. Contract owner improvement is generally being achieved through some level of underlying tools and systems. But beyond that, we're also seeing much clearer definition of the responsibilities of the contract owner and perhaps more formalization of periodic reviews where they actually come in and explain what they're doing and how it's going, and you know, where there is a much more formalized approach to actually monitoring that contract's performance and not the historic acceptance that actually a high proportion of contracts today fail. What again about that with you, Bill or Eric? Any further thoughts on contract ownership?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I'd like to take that. As far as contract ownership, one of the most critical things that I would say is, as you are looking at implementing processes or technologies, just make sure you don't back yourself into a corner. And it's, you know, sort of common sense advice, but here's what I mean by that. In practice, what we found is a number of organizations, and this is true for sort of mid-market companies all the way up to the largest of the Fortune 500, what they usually will do is implement a system partially, that is to address a specific need. Maybe it's a procurement contract efficiency. Maybe it's corralling all of your real estate agreements, your leases, and so on. So usually contract initiatives in an organization will start by identifying a problem, making sure that is a priority. There's a real budget and a real sort of steering committee that's driving that process. And then they get to work and try to address that problem using a contract lifecycle management solution. What we would say is that's not a bad approach, but make sure you leave yourself room for growth. Lots of systems and lots of processes take into account sales or procurement or real estate or HR contracts without taking into account the broader implications. So as you are thinking about your processes and the technology, ask the right questions. We're looking at adopting a system to address procurement contract request efficiencies. Can we grow this into sales contracts or employment contracts? Just make sure that you're not backing yourself into a corner either via process or via technology selection.
So a question for you guys. I don't know which one of you would like to take this one. How does Selectica enforce workflow and ensure it's completed?
Sure, I can go ahead and take that one as well, Tim. You know, it's a combination of setting up the right processes, the right people, getting the right people involved, and also making sure that you have a true enterprise class workflow engine. So as far as a true enterprise class workflow engine is concerned, I'll take the last one since it's probably the easiest to tackle. What are some of the things that you're looking for there? Well, what we do that works really well is not just provide workflows around sort of simple stepwise processes, manager to director to VP type approvals. But what you're looking at also is approval workflows and processing workflows that take into account the contract metadata itself, as well as information around the contract process itself. So metadata around the actual contract approval process. I'll give you one example. Let's say that I need to process a contract and I report to Tim, for example, in an organization. If I'm on vacation for 2 weeks, the system should be smart enough to alert Tim that a contract hasn't been touched for, whatever the policy states, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, a week, whatever it is. The system should be able to proactively take that contract and forward it on to Tim for further processing so that it doesn't slow down, so that you don't have contracts fall through the cracks. That's one area where I would say Selectica is particularly powerful, and I would say that from a user adoption perspective, we find that that tends to be a strong indicator of whether a CLM project will experience successful user adoption or experience failure because the users tend to work around the system because it doesn't really support the way they work.
And another one coming your way. Is there any automation between contracting tool to ERP system? For example, the transfer of metadata from contract into material master and vendor record, vendor master.
Sure, it's a great question, and thank you for that. Yeah, I'd say that in the early days of cloud-based applications, there was a decided emphasis on trying to cover all aspects of an organization's agreements, all the way from contract to sales and procure and supplier management to contracts to AR and AP. The reason is that web services really weren't mature enough to allow for seamless data transfer between systems like a contract lifecycle management system and an enterprise resource planning system. That problem has since been solved, right? So a number of systems today now use what are called REST-based web services to ensure that data is exchanged not only just at a basic level, but at a meaningful level that drives workflow compliance and can trigger specific steps in a workflow that will bring contracts to the attention of the right stakeholders as well.
And finally, I think we're pretty much out of time. This may be a quick one. I don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. How often have compelling events been a driver for workflow?
So yeah, Tim, this is Bill. I'll take a stab at that. I think as we look across our install base, oftentimes we'll find that the selection or the initiation of the entire CLM initiative was based upon a compelling event. The example that Eric used today is one example of that, and we do see that fairly consistently. Unfortunately, that compelling event is the reason to really move into that maturity curve that I talked about. So we had a repository in place, but that did not prevent this issue from being solved. So I really need to up the ante-MI investment in terms of people, process, and technology.
Very good. So we are out of time, I think, at this point. I thank you very much, Bill, Eric, for your inputs to this, and thank you very much to our audience for all of your questions and your attention throughout the program. I hope you found it a useful insight, and it's given you confirmation of why workflow matters, what workflow is, and indeed what you might and should be doing about it within your organizations in order to drive the sort of value potential that we've been discussing. Thank you, everybody. We hope to be back with you again soon. And of course, if you've got any follow-on questions, don't hesitate to send them in to myself, but more particularly, I'm sure, to Eric or Bill. I'll be delighted to hear from you. Thank you. Bye-bye.